Every time you tip, Chuck Norris roundhouse kicks a Justin Bieber fan in the face. While this is obviously not true, it does lead me into the topic I want to try to persuade you in. While I have not been a server before, I do know how the pay distribution works. I also believe in principles and acts of kindness. We as college students need to understand this topic because we, more than probably anybody else, know what it's like to need to budget our money, and we also know what it's like to not have too much money. For servers, tips are pretty much all the money that they make. It's a majority of the change that they get. So if they have a bad night of tips, it makes it harder for them to live off of. No matter how bad your service is, you should always tip. It's respectful, responsible, and it could make someone's day. You do not know what's going on in their personal life. You don't know what's going on behind the scenes at the restaurant, and you also have a responsibility to tip your waiter or waitress. Your waiter or waitress might be having a bad day. They might be bringing their personal life into work, and even though that's not supposed to happen, it still does. It's part of life. It's part of being a human being. It happens to probably everybody some point or another, no matter where they work. Maybe they're going through a difficult time at home, might have gotten up late because they had a family emergency, or they're just caught up in a whole bunch of schoolwork. While it should not really have an effect on how they work, it still does, and you need to respect that because it happens to almost everybody. They also might have had something happen with the boss, might have had a stand-in with the boss, could get them worked up, and they might be scheduled for a long day and not have any breaks. So you need to respect all of that. It's not your right to judge what goes on behind the scenes and what goes on with a waiter or waitress, so you really shouldn't be judging. It's also not always their fault, no matter what. Could be something going on with the rest of the store or the restaurant. Maybe you're not pleased with the quality of the food. A lot of times you're quick to assume that it's the fault of the server, but many times it's probably the fault of the cook. In Tony Bucci's 2014 article, 5 Reasons Why You Should Always Tip Your Server, seriously, he says the purpose of a waiter or waitress from the perspective of the customer is as follows: to help us understand the restaurant and what kind of food it specializes in, to take our order correctly and have the kitchen begin preparing it as soon as possible, to make sure we are comfortable while we wait for the food and we eat it, and to bring us what we ordered or relay our grievances if we do not receive what we wanted. So instead of just being quick to blame the waiter or waitress, think about the fact that it might not be their fault. It could just be something that happened in the kitchen, and it could have just been a mishap back there. It might not have even been the fault of the cook or anything. They might also be understaffed or just staffed incorrectly at the restaurant. Maybe your server has too many tables to deal with, or they might have a big table or two that they have to deal with. This takes up a lot more time because if they have too many tables, they have to run around and try to serve each table as quick as possible, take all their orders, make sure they're all okay, and that just gets very overwhelming. And if they have many big tables, then it takes a whole lot longer to take their food orders, make sure they're all acquainted correctly, make sure they get their food, make sure it's all correct. And Tony Bucci also says in his article, customers are obnoxious, and it's the server's job to see to it that each person's individual needs are met to the best of their ability. So you need to think about that too, because they might get overwhelmed or have too much on their plate because they're trying to make sure everybody's getting the best experience they can, and when they have to run around or take all these big orders, it just makes it so much more difficult on the server. Well, it could be something that goes on with the restaurant, whether it's the cook or management or anything. It could also be the server's fault, but that does not mean that you should not tip them. This is because they don't really make any money outside of tips. They also did take the time to wait on you. In Gigi Moody's 2015 article, An Open Letter, Why You Should Always Tip Your Servers at Least 15%, she says, because of the fact that the federal government is expecting the customers to always be tipping at least 15% whenever they eat out, the federal minimum wage for servers is $2.13 an hour. No matter how poor the service is, you're still expected to tip. Whenever you have a bad day at the office, it doesn't mean that you're not going to get paid for that day. It just means that you might be going through something, and everybody needs to respect other people and their personal lives or what goes on behind the scenes, because you really should not be judging, like I said before. In Sarah Max's article, Should You Always Tip in Cash at Restaurants, written in 2016, she says, if you ask anybody in the service industry, they will probably tell you that cash is universally preferred. Cash tips can go home at the end of a shift and be used immediately for groceries and other living expenses. It also makes sure that there's nothing screwy that goes on whenever you pay a tip on the card, because the restaurant could say that you didn't tip them as much as you really did. They could try to keep some of the money. So it just assures that the server gets the amount of money that you want them to get. Ruth Margolis states in 2012's Tipping America, How to Do It and What to Expect If You Don't. If you're not brave enough to withhold the entire tip and trash your waiter to his superior, leaving 10% as code for the service was awful. It's respectful to give money no matter what. Whenever you get a service, you're always supposed to give at least a little bit of something. And for servers, it's obviously money because you can't really tip them anything else. You might go in with high expectations, but if there's a new or a new server or anybody or anything, then you have to respect that they're not going to be the greatest that you expect them to be. They're not going to be as quick as maybe some of the typical waiters or waitresses you have. You have to give them time to learn. You can't just complain to them all the time and get frustrated, because it just overwhelms them and just causes a whole lot of things to happen that shouldn't be happening. If you get better service, you should pay a better tip. This is really how you should judge how much you should tip. Keep in mind tipping when ordering, because the more expensive your meal is, the more you're expected to tip, and percentages. Some people don't leave a tip despite the service. It could have been the best service they've ever gotten, but they still refuse to tip. And if that happens, they really don't deserve to be there. It's disrespectful, and you don't deserve to have that great of service if you can't appreciate the fact that people are trying to give you the best service that they can. If you're on a tight budget, try not to spend as much money on your meal, because it will cause you to be expected to give a bigger tip. But if you buy a little less, you don't have to give as big of a tip. If you just don't want to tip anybody, if you don't want to deal with tips, then go to a fast food restaurant. It's cheaper, you get your food faster, and you don't have to worry about tipping. All in all, keep in mind you should always tip. Whether or not it's the fault of the customer, whether it's their personal life coming into play, or they're just having a bad night, or just something's going on, if they're just not that good of a server, or if it's the cook or management or other customers, it's respectful and your job as a customer to give a tip. When people wait on you, you're always supposed to give a little bit of money. When you get a service, you need to respect it. You're not serving yourself, and that should be recognized. As Jason Kent said, two people become one when two are in love, or when the waitress asks about our dinner bill. I'll pay next time, I promise. Thank you.